It's great to have you with us today for lunch, even though it's a virtual lunch. I'm very excited to have David Denby on as my guest today. Many of you probably know David from his decades as the film critic for New York Magazine and then The New Yorker, or maybe as the author of great books, his best-selling account of going back to college in middle age to re-engage with literary masterworks, or American Sucker about a midlife crisis that led him to a more dangerous encounter with the stock market. We're here today to talk about his new book, Eminent Jews, a work that fully embraces the mission of the American Jewish Historical Society, which is to foster awareness and appreciation of American Jewish heritage. He has beautifully captured the crackling post-World War II era, a golden age for Jews, through the lives of four famous and famously contentious Jewish Americans. They loomed large in the public imagination for their work and their outsized personalities, and their willingness to proclaim their Jewishness boldly and often provocatively. You can read the book as a collection of entertaining and perceptive short biographies of Mel Brooks, Norman Mailer, Betty Friedan, and Leonard Bernstein. Dainu, that would be enough. But Denby goes further. He takes us beyond analysis of personal and professional achievement to a contemplation of what America has meant to Jews and vice versa. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you so much. What an intro. I can open on Broadway with that intro.
Yeah, are you singing? Or make a musical. It'll be great.
Whatever. I can perform in any way you require. I have to tell you that your alma mater, the Wall Street Journal, ran a piece that accused, could you hold up the book cover again? That accused me of anti-Semitism for putting these wonderful David Levine caricatures on the cover of the book. So, not wanting to be a patsy, I immediately sent the book to the ADL because he said the ADL should be aware of this atrocity that was going on, and they immediately got back to me and said, "We have no problem here. We're dying to read your book." End of story. Okay.
Well, you actually skipped ahead. I was going to ask you about that review, which I read, which I thought was, well, Joe, I mean, he's pretty famous for that, or infamous, I guess, for that kind of a review. But I was interested in your decision to write back to him. The journal published your response, and I thought it was a very good response, but I was also wondering what made you decide to do it, because I'm sure in your years of reviewing movies, you got plenty of letters from people over the years. And I just wondered what it was that made you decide in this particular case to respond.
Well, I thought it was sort of wondrous that the journal assigned a book about four rebels, the four that you mentioned, to an 88-year-old cultural reactionary. I mean, it felt like a setup. I don't see how Joseph Epstein could not have written that review. And I thought, I mean, he denigrated all four of them, accused me of anti-Semitism, and of course denigrated the book. So I wrote them a letter and they published it. And then I posted it on my Facebook page, and many people sent support, including other journalists, filmmakers, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of fun to read that, actually. It sort of was like the good old days, I guess, when critics would have these back and forth discussions about things
Yes, you're right.
in literary journals. So that it was kind of fun to see it, even though I guess that kind of thing now is sort of relegated to the comments pages.
Yeah.
Well, great, but I'm going to hold up the book again. I actually love the cover, and I love those caricatures, and I love the people. Well, I don't know if I love, but fascinated by the people you chose to write about. But I think a lot of people are curious to know how you chose these subjects among so many possible eminent Jews. But I have a two-part question about that. One, how you chose these particular people, but also which came first, sort of your desire to sort of explore this aspect of American Jewish culture, this golden age of acceptance, or did you want to write about these particular people and found this connecting thread?
I think the latter. I mean, I had written about Mailer for the New Yorker a couple of times. I spent a couple of days with him when he was 75 and in a very gentle stage of his life. I visited him in Provincetown. And I had, argued in my head with everything that Leonard Bernstein did because I adored him. And, and I wrote about him for the New Yorker a couple of times. Um, so that was there, and I thought, well, what unites these people? And then I began to think about Betty Friedan because of this feminine mystique, which in 1963 she was hardly the only feminist working at that point and writing at that point, but her book hit like lightning, and people, even women who didn't read it or just heard about it, were electrified by the notion that women were, considered by definition in an inferior status in this country. Her specific subjects were suburban white women, but what she wrote applied to all women. And that had a jolting effect on me. And Mel, of course, as a movie critic, I got to review his movies, and I was a fan of the 2,000-Year-Old Man. So I thought, what do these four have in common? Well, they were born just after the First World War. They emerged after the Second World War in a time of reduced anti-Semitism, which Jewish organizations, let's put the credit where it belongs, were largely responsible for fighting anti-Semitism after World War II. And the obvious fact that American Jews economically were doing well. Not
Mhm.
in oil and steel and chemicals and railroads and that kind of big industry, but in law and medicine and business and all the intellectual professions and entertainment, every kind of business and everything else. You weren't supposed to talk about that for a long time. You didn't want to poke the bear, shush. But so, okay, it became impossible to ignore that. So I thought, okay, so here's a period of prosperity for American Jews, relative safety. And how do these four respond to the Jewish inheritance of their parents who were immigrants or second generation? How did they respond and how did they change the way Jews behaved? So that was what brought these four together.
Yeah, it struck me reading the book, like, maybe because the HHS had just finished we have a podcast series that looks at Jews after World War II, the Jewish refugee experience, and the second season focuses on the Red Scare. And so that was happening simultaneous as this group of people were sort of coming into their own. And it was sort of interesting to read your book after just thinking about the Red Scare in America, because it was something about the 50s where there was this incredible repression, but also this sort of exuberant bursting of breaking norms. And I was wondering if you thought about that at all while you were writing the book.
Well, I mean, Lenny had political problems. The FBI had a file on him. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and for a while, he wasn't asked to conduct the New York Philharmonic. After making his famous debut in 1953, there was a gap. I mean, he was hardly inactive. He wrote two symphonies. He wrote three shows. He was all over the place. And then finally, he took over the Philharmonic in 1958. But in that 15-year gap, there was periods when the FBI was suspicious of him. He was certainly not a communist or a fellow traveler. He was an ardent liberal who believed in civil rights and human rights and was in love with the nascent state of Israel. I mean, and he was, I would say, an international humanist. I mean, it's as if Beethoven's Ninth, with its message in the last movement of brotherhood, was constantly playing in his head. I mean, you might say that was a little naive, but I mean, he did when he took the Philharmonic to Berlin in 1960. Okay, Berlin, 1960, and it was a concert for students, um, and he started speaking to them in Hebrew. And
Hmm.
there was a kind of shock for a while, and then they got it. They got it. An American Jew was bringing a great orchestra to their city and addressing them in Hebrew, the center of the Nazi, and they broke into applause. I mean, it was a concert. He played Beethoven's first piano concerto and conducted it. But I mean, he did that kind of thing. He took the Israel Philharmonic to Vienna and Berlin later on. So he was very conscious of that kind of political role. And he loved the Kennedys and so on. The others, Mel is not a political person. I mean, you know, he's a very well-read liberal. Betty also a standard liberal, and when she started writing for left-wing trade union newspapers, but I think that she it was just because she needed to write and to work, and she got into the women's magazines then, and then from there went to her real passion, feminine mystique. And Mailer had a sort of pass at left-wing politics when he was very, very young, and then thereafter he became a chronicler. He wrote about the Kennedys, he wrote about Nixon, he wrote about Humphrey, he wrote about Gene McCarthy, Barry Goldwater, better than anyone has ever written about American political people. That stuff has to be revived. It should all be the reports on the convention should all be in one book.
Yeah, and I was so glad that you're drawing attention to Mailer and to the Executioner's Song, which is such an incredible piece of work and so much of his writing. And I wonder if the current generation of young people coming into adulthood are as aware of Mailer as other writers. I don't know, but
He had a lot of women friends that, you know, in his own time. I mean, Diana Trilling, whom one thinks of as being rather haughty. I won't say that his famous opening line to her at a party, but it's in the book, and it's filthy, and she loved it. And they became very close friends. And Joan Didion, a little later, was a great supporter of his work, as was Lillian Hellman and Doris Kearns Goodwin and people like that. But currently, if women hear his name, they shudder. Young women.
yeah, which is really a shame because
It's a shame.
he's really a great writer. In fact, I was lucky enough to interview him when I was working at the Times. It was just a couple of years before he died, and he was so frail. But he was an incredible flirt. And after the interview, he wrote to me and sent me these little cartoon drawings that were so cute. And he gave me a little analysis of the interview. He was very charming. You could see that. And you point out in the book, and ultimately for all of his wildness and craziness and trying to kill his wife, he was also this sort of respectable bourgeois person.
Well, that is the paradox which I work on a great deal. Was it? Yes, he butted heads at parties. I mean, you know, the Wild Party was a big part of 1950s, 1960s intellectual and artistic life, particularly in New York, maybe other places too. I just don't know. California, maybe. But in the spirit of nonconformity, you know, the idea was to get really plastered. And he was good at that, and fights would break out, as well as the dreadful night in which he assaulted his wife, other parties as well. But when I saw him when he was 75, his pugilistic days were over, and he couldn't have been more gracious. And many people say that, you know, when he wasn't drinking, he he was a novelist. He wanted to understand what made people tick. He would look at them. He would shut his mouth, and the brow would furrow, and he would try to take you in, try to understand you, what made you tick. I mean, this is when he was young, when he was in his 30s.
Yeah.
So he and his manners could be exquisite. Many people have said that. I mean, he was ceremonious when he met people. So the notion of Mailer as out of control brawler is just a little piece of the truth. And as you said a minute ago, even though there were 6 wives, and he was a philanderer, certainly. I don't think he was faithful to any of them. He was, in his way, a bourgeois, upper middle class, Jewish American parent. I mean, he insisted that there were 9 kids altogether, and I've met them, Julie. They're fine, and
Uh-huh.
they all have a kind of soulful element that they got from their father. They seem, good to me. Anyway, he insisted, they not do any dope before they graduated college. They all went to very good schools. He ran a kind of intellectual summer camp instead of scavenger hunts. They would put on a play by Tennessee Williams. I mean, just an amazing. He was always challenging himself and always challenging his children. And sometimes it was onerous, and other times they profited from it brilliantly.
So I know this is going to sound crazy talking about a book whose title is Eminent Jews, but I found myself surprised at how Jewish your book is in very deep and kind of surprising ways. And I love this thing you wrote about Mailer, where you say running away from Judaism and toward it at the same time, Mailer almost helplessly contradicts himself. He celebrates the suppression of the law among modern Jews while succumbing to some of its oldest prohibitions. I think you were talking about masturbation there, but anyway.
Yes,
And then the way you connected, the way Leonard Bernstein had this full body conducting style, comparing it, saying that it grew maybe from the Hasidic dancing he saw his father do on Jewish
definitely.
holidays. And
Yeah.
I was wondering, because of the way the book is framed, Eminent Jews, um, how did thinking about your subjects through this Jewish lens change, if it did change, your initial perceptions of them or how you thought about them?
Well, looking at Mailer, you would think, oh, he's not very Jewish. I mean, he seemed to be defining himself against the habits of his parents' generation. Um, they believed in thou shalt not. Norman believed in thou shalt.
Yeah.
If he had some impulse from the deep, he didn't take it on the couch, which is what you did in the 1950s if you were in the middle class and upper middle class, to find out what, trauma from when you were 2 produced some neurotic symptoms in the present, psychoanalysis. No, if there was an impulse from the depth that was authentic, you had to act on it. Reverse the whole Freudian therapy, which caused people trouble and caused trouble for himself, but it was his way of avoiding shame. Shame was a very large part of his temperament. Shame that he had not failed to act on the chances he had, that he had chickened out in some way. So running away from the good Jewish boy, he invented the bad Jewish boy. So I mean, so it was, and he always said Jews are here to do serious thinking. He didn't write about the Holocaust, but he was very much aware of it, impressed by it. He told a German publication in the 50s that he lost any possibility of faith after he realized what the Holocaust meant.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and Betty was certainly aware of the reduced status of women in traditional Judaism, and of course resented it like hell. And if she heard any anti-Semitism in the room, she would just flare up. I mean, and then she had a period in her late 50s when she studied with a rabbi in Los Angeles and did some work at Brandeis on texts. And Lenny, of course, was obsessed with the Old Testament, and I think pursued a God he wasn't quite sure existed at all. I mean, the Kaddish Symphony Number 3, which has some great music and it sounds like Shostakovich. Some of it has a speaker who, like Job, questions God, but even sort of bumptiously assails God. And it's like he's trying to chase God into being. So, I mean, and then he wrote Chichester Psalms, which is one of his most beautiful pieces for an English Anglican cathedral. But it has Jewish text in it. And this crazy, I don't know if you've ever seen it, Julie, the Crazy Mass, which is a kind of Jewish Catholic Mass, which has everything thrown into it. So he was certainly obsessed with Jewish text and Jewish culture uh, all his life. And Mel, of course, the word Jew popped out of him, particularly when he was sitting with a certain Methodist from the Middle West who had a nightly audience of 20 million people, namely Jay Carson. The word Jew just popped out of him. I said like nuggets out of a gumball machine. He couldn't stop saying it.
Well,
So
it's funny, after I read that in your book, I actually Googled it, and you can actually see clips of that show with Johnny Carson on YouTube, and it's wild. I mean, it's real. I highly recommend, after you read David's book, Google the Johnny Carson Mel Brooks episode, because it's pretty great. But
this is
listen, following up. Oh,
go
sorry. Go
ahead.
ahead. No, you
No,
go
no,
ahead.
you go ahead.
So following up on this, because I kind of was fascinated the way your book um, grapples a lot with Jewish texts and philosophy and history. And so you talk a little bit about your own background in the prologue, but not too much about your own Jewish identity and upbringing. How did writing this book inform and deepen what you knew and didn't know about your own Jewish knowledge and feeling, I should say?
Well, my parents were children of immigrants. They were mid-level executives in the garment district, and they came triumphantly through the Depression. You could not say a word against Franklin Roosevelt in our house. I don't think they know that he was negligent about the Holocaust, but they certainly thought he was responsible for their success. So I grew up in privileged circumstances. We weren't wealthy, but we were certainly comfortable. And I went to good schools in New York. And I was, I think, pretty much in a Jewish middle class environment, both at the Fieldston School and in those days at Columbia, which was about 40% Jewish undergraduates. So I think the answer, Julie, is that I more or less took it for granted. It wasn't, I certainly, asserted I was Jewish, I was bar mitzvahed and, all of that. But it wasn't central to my emotions until later. And I find myself, uh, I'm a secular Zionist. I believe that Israel has every right to exist, and I disapprove completely of the Netanyahu government. I mean, it's possible to be an American Jewish liberal secular Zionist and believe in absolutely Israel's right to exist and completely deplore the current policies of Israel. It's not as if you have to choose. Peter Beinart has written article after article, book after book, saying Jews have to choose either liberalism or Israel. They can't, nonsense. So I feel a kind of kinship with Jews everywhere, I have to say. And I'm very insistent that I don't like talk of good Jews and bad Jews. Julie, there aren't enough of us to make categories. It's a little over 2% in a country of 330 million people, namely 7 million plus American Jews, 0.02% in the world, out of 15 million maybe, out of 80 billion people. I mean, being Jewish means to me is that, yes, whether you believe in the monotheistic God, you have to recognize it's an extraordinary notion of a God, a single God, not a God system or a tripart God, that you cannot see, that you must talk to in your brain. Even Freud, the greatest atheist of the 20th century, said this is a major step forward in the intellectual development of the West, the monotheistic God, because he just hints at this. It led to conceptual thinking like higher mathematics and philosophy, and physics. So, I mean, you have to admit that the very gifted young man who preached in Galilee and Jerusalem was not the Son of God, but was just a very, very gifted Jewish priest and preacher. And I hope that you would have some feeling for Jewish history, which is fascinating. It's often very depressing, but it's also can be very moving. And there are many very good books that one could recommend, and that perhaps since we were strangers in a strange land ourselves, as the text says, that you feel some sympathy for the outsider and the stranger in America. So that tends one towards political liberalism. That's quite a lot, but I mean, those are my. Uh, Basically, I'm not saying you have to convert. I'm saying you have to assert your Jewishness and make some connection to Jewish history.
Yeah, well, I don't have to convert. I'm pretty Jewish. So, but yeah,
Yeah.
no, but I know what you're saying. And actually, tying back to something you said earlier, when you talked about Mailer being so motivated or driven or wrapped around the idea of shame, it's really funny you use shame because a friend of mine and I used to have these very long discussions about shame versus guilt. And, thinking about, you always associate Jews or popularly associate Jews with guilt and maybe Catholics more with shame. And I was interested that you used that idea around Mailer, and I wonder if it extends to your other subjects as well. Shame,
I don't
guilt.
think they suffered from guilt. They
Mm.
had very robust egos. They were also very generous at the same time, which is the paradox that I try to work on. I don't think Mel he's still alive for God's sakes, has any neuroses at all. I mean, he wasn't weakened by having an adoring mother. He was strengthened by having an adoring mother. I mean, he expelled his aggression and energy and entertained people, for 75 years. I mean, I don't, and Betty was ashamed when she felt she wasn't drawing on all her resources, and she associates that to being Jewish. That I guess she does use the word guilt, but that she wasn't making the most of what she had. They were all caught in this extreme, intense notion of making the most of yourself in this world, because what happens after death, certainly in the Old Testament, there's a very shadowy, if non-existent, right, a notion of an afterlife. It's certainly not like Christianity. There's that Hasidic tale about Rabbi Zusya,
Oh,
and
yeah.
Rabbi Zusya says, he tells the tale himself. It's a one sentence tale. He said, when Zusya gets to heaven, he did believe in heaven. He said, when Zusya gets to heaven, they're not going to say to him, why weren't you Moses? They're going to say to him, why weren't you Zusya? Think about that for a second. Meaning, why weren't you the best version of Zusya? Why didn't you make the most of what God gave you and what you gave yourself in this world? That is a Jewish drive, that's in all four of them. And I think it accounts for certain craziness, like Mailer's extreme impatience and his desire to constantly remake himself, to transform. Betty's impatience. She was sure that she knew the way feminism should go. And when she started the National Organization of Women, which was very important in the middle '60s, and these were distinguished women generally in business from New York. And I mean, at her level, if there was a meeting, she would just like talk through it. She had a stage whisper I wrote that could have reached New Jersey. I mean, there was a kind of extraordinary impatience in her, and I think it derives from that sense that you must make the best of yourself, and that is a disgrace if you don't. And it comes from Jewish history. Also, you constantly had to be adaptable and on guard and wary. If we're talking about, I don't know, 15th century, 14th century, because you didn't quite know where the threat was going to come from, which in turn, according to certain scholars, made the Jews very well equipped to be successful in the 20th century, apart from certain unpleasantness in Central Europe between 1939 and 1945. The Jews, by their historical background, their temperament, were well equipped. This is Yuri Sleskin, great Russian historian who moved to Berkeley. They were very well equipped to succeed in the 20th century. So
You know,
go ahead.
yeah. So I hope our audience can tell from listening to the way you talk about the people you write about and your thought process, how really interesting the book is in terms of how you approach them and how you approach the subject, that it's not just this happened and that happened. There's a whole engagement and thought process going on there. And so I think people would be really interested, even though you may not want to relive it, but what was the process of researching and writing this, I think, pretty daunting enterprise? Like, I mean, it's not like these are people who people hadn't written about before. And so I wish you could just sort of tell procedurally, like, where did you start and how did you proceed and what did it feel like while you were doing it?
Well, it was very hard. And I wrote many drafts. It was at one point much longer because these people had tumultuous lives. I mean, I didn't talk about a third of what Mailer did because it was impossible. I left out parts of, I mean, anything of Mel's that where it didn't quite work out. Like he tried to work in the theater and so on in his youth. That didn't always. I left all of that out. But I did. I read the relevant biographies. There's a great biography of Mailer by Mike J. Michael Lennon, and
Yeah.
there's you know it, yeah. And there's a great biography of Bernstein. So there were good books, but I did as much archival research as I could. So I looked at Lenny's scores, the Mahler scores. Mahler was very important to him, and very important to the Mahler is very important to the whole section on Bernstein. At the New York Philharmonic, you can look at his scores and see his pencil marks, and that was very illuminating. I talked to his children with Betty. I went up to the Schlesinger Library which has enormous resources about Betty Friedan. And I spent, I think, 4 days reading her notes and finding her notes, her fervent notes to herself. And when she was trying to get going on the feminine mystique, she was just a fire. And she would take a normal 8.5 by 11 page unlined paper, Julie, and turn it sideways and crease it down the center and write a few words on the left side and then a few words or maybe a few sentences on the right side and then do another page on top of that. So she was sort of like making a book out of ordinary paper. I mean, she so much wanted to will this book into existence and became completely obsessed to the point of writing in black ink on the marital sheets in the middle of the night. Uh, that marriage had a lot of problems, but this couldn't have helped at all. I mean, she was obsessed in that period when she was working on it because she was in possession of truth. She felt that, she had to get out there. And when you're obsessed that way, everyone else seems dull and unfocused and like that. So
Well, you must have felt a certain amount of that obsession yourself as you were putting this together, I would imagine.
I was, I didn't just, I would go from one to the other and then rewrite each one individually. And it was too long, and my agent glared at me. And so I cut it, 25,000 words at least. And I think it gained from the compression. Uh,
Yeah. So
I,
so
tr
somebody has a question here that I want to
sure.
include because it sort of relates to she says in the prologue, you make the point that the four eminent Jews you selected had similar personal characteristics and they were not German Jews. What did you really mean?
Oh, I meant that they weren't proper. They
Ah,
weren't afraid of you know some sort of disastrous appearance that was a failure of propriety. The German Jews were famous for assimilating more than they needed to assimilate. Essentially they wanted to be Episcopalians. I mean, that's a bit of a joke. It doesn't include everyone, certainly, and there were very many successful and wonderful people. But the ones of Russian descent had a trace of exuberance and rebellion and even vulgarity that they held on to from their Russian background that was healthy. And the great thing was that it wasn't extinguished in the United States. I mean, you can't imagine Mel Brooks, as being a German Jew. I mean, it's just impossible, or Mailer either. And so they there was a theatrical element and a desire to outrage people. And I think they had an effect. I mean, I think, how shall I put it? I think they released the Jewish body from the kind of restraints that the earlier generations felt. I mean, and it starts with Mailer, particularly in his big war novel, The Naked and the Dead, which is at its greatest is about the extent of exhaustion in wartime of the male body. And he celebrated the male body in all of its manifestations, violent, sexual, and everything else. That was different from the way Jews thought about such things earlier. And Mel, the body in all of its, how shall I put it, its effusions and its liquidity. I mean, its ejaculations, whatever, which he thought was, a sign of life, a sign against death. I mean, and that's the center of his comedy, is the body exploding. So I think that those are Russian Jewish rather than German Jewish characteristics. And Lenny's fantastically, excitable and physically active conducting style, which offended, to be particular, the German Jewish music critics in New York in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, until they understand that he was in no way losing control. Then, on the contrary, he was asserting control. He subdivided the beat. He cued in all of the solos, and orchestras loved playing under him because he was very easy to follow. And what he did was give a kind of emotional narrative alongside of the emotional narrative of the music itself. He taught us how to listen to these incredibly complex scores by Mahler, say. So, and that was a full body experience. So I think that was one way that the Russian Jews helped liberate the Jewish body.
So let me ask you something. Who do you think would be the eminent Jews for the next generation? If you were looking at them and trying to think who would be the Mailer Brooks Free, would it be Larry David or Jerry Seinfeld or Jon Stewart or Steven Spielberg or Bob Dylan? I don't know. Like, have you thought about that at all? I
Well,
mean,
all of those, and if you just skip to those born in the 30s, of course, you've got Philip Roth, Susan Sontag, um, the great Dodger left-hander, Sandy Koufax, the greatest left-handed pitcher of all time.
but
Yeah.
those were the same generation as, but I'm saying the subsequent generation.
Well,
And
they're
I
they're a
guess
little bit later than my four.
but I guess it's
Yeah,
also like what's different about what would you see as the unifying thing, the connection, because they had already, they'd already inherited the gifts of the people you write about, right? The next
exactly.
generation.
Exactly. You can see that Roth has inherited Mailer and Bellow to some degree, and that Larry David has inherited Mel Brooks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't imagine Larry David without Mel Brooks. So they took everything further. I mean, the whole generation of Mad magazine creators were
Yeah.
Jewish, and in the 50s and 60s, and they sort of undermined American popular culture with satire, parody, and all of that. So, and these people have all had disciples, like Michael Tilson Thomas is a great conductor, and was very close to Lenny. And Mailer, I would say there are writers like Don DeLillo and Joan Didion who definitely show his obsession with the underlying traumas of American life, what's flowing underground, not just the surface, which they do extremely well, but the miasmas, the obsessions, the craziness that flows underground. Those two writers, in particular. So those are all influences. I think Freudianism has certainly in its sort of middlebrow notion of you had to adjust to a society, the 50s notion of psychoanalysis has more or less been overthrown. I mean, it can be very, very useful for certain things, and Freud's cultural writing is remarkable, but people are not going on the couch anymore And Mailer was one of the people who led the revolt. He thought if people were psychoanalyzed, the most interesting parts of them drained away. He wanted, he said, if when they lose their craziness, they're no longer interesting. So I think we believe that. So they had that kind of effect. Who is the greatest writer to follow them? Philip Roth, for sure. And now I would say Joshua Cohn, the novelist Joshua Cohn, whose book, The Netanyahus, which is about the Netanyahu family in the 50s visiting an American university, is quite, an explosive piece of fiction.
It
So
is.
it carries on that influence.
So I can't believe we're getting close to the end, but I do want you to answer one question that I've been thinking about. So I first met you, David, when I was a beginning movie critic at the Wall Street Journal, and you were a very well-known critic at New York Magazine. And I would walk into those screening rooms with you and Pauline Kael and Janet Maslin and be completely intimidated. But
Oh,
you bring so much of that critical eye to your subjects, but writing books is a very different enterprise than being a critic. Well, yes and no, but you were a critic for a long time. And I guess what I'd
yeah.
like to ask you, what was it like for you making the switch from being a professional critic to being an author and being criticized, I
Well,
guess?
I was never all in, Julie. I mean, I was always interested in something else. So I wrote when I was at New York Magazine, I wrote that long book about going back to Columbia and reading
Yeah.
Western classics and what did that mean in a period when that was all being denigrated. I think it's even more valuable now, but that's a whole other story. So I wrote a book about my marriage falling apart when I got obsessed with the dot-com explosion. Remember that folly?
American Sucker. Yeah, that was.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That title, which everyone told me not to use, but I did. So I was never all in as a movie critic, but I love the discipline and the excitement of it. And because I wrote for weekly magazines, I was very, very lucky. I could just choose the best stuff to write about. I didn't have to write about routine openings. But I lost interest because of digital filmmaking. Um, I like things to be staged in real space. I mean, of course, there are incredibly beautiful things you can do with digital fantasy, but and some of the things in Spider-Man and Batman were astonishing. But tell you the truth, I got bored at a certain point with a lot of, how shall I put, exacerbated algorithms fighting, from nowhere to nowhere in midair. I mean, nothing grounded. That's one reason why I and many people my generation just adored Anora. Have
Oh,
you
yeah.
have you seen Anora? Oh my
I
God.
loved it.
I
Yeah.
loved it. Right. And I
So
mean,
fun.
real people and, it's real space and what's at stake and the geography of those rooms and of that house and of the neighborhood and everything. That to me is heaven. So, I mean, I don't miss doing all of these summer spectacles. You run out of witticisms and you turn sour. I mean, I don't have to tell you, you know what that's like. I mean,
Yeah.
so uh, on the one hand, I was not always full-time movie critic. My brain was always thinking about other things. I would say that music is the most important thing to me, and literature second, and movies third. But every once in a while, I reignite I mean, Anora. Just I was in heaven when I saw that movie. So it hasn't faded. It's there. But I mean, when you write a New Yorker profile, which I did a few times. You do, like half of a book's worth of researching and interviewing and rereading and so on. So I was able to switch, I think, to biographical writing without too big a strain. The trouble is there was too much material, as I said before, and I had to keep compressing and throwing out. That was the anguish of it. There's more to these people than I'm letting you know. I mean, I'm packing as much in there as I can, but I'm conscious that there's more.
So your anguish, our pleasure. And here
Uh,
you have it, movies, literature, music, and feminism all in one book. Thank you so much for being our guest today. It was really fun talking to you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And as we said before, there's life after film criticism for both
You
of us.
got it. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.